Welcome to the book club. We are few this time. The same ones from the previous meeting are not there. Catalina and Jesse warned that they were not going to connect because they had personal problems. Mayako will connect in a while, so the four of us are here. As we said in the previous meeting, each reader has to have a physical or digital book. I am trying to get the municipality to lend us some money for face-to-face meetings. By the way, I am a writer and Gervais Sudi is the same. I introduce myself. I am Fernando Ezequiel Sanchez. I'm the one who wants to give you this presentation. During the virtual book club meeting, Maria introduced herself first and talked about her love of reading and her involvement in the Animal Project with special children and seniors. He also mentioned his favorite authors and his interest in learning more about the Rio Grande. Later, Gervais Sudi presented a project in which they are working to publish a book with several writers and highlight the local culture. At the meeting, they also discussed the importance of supporting emerging authors and giving them a space to showcase their talent. Gervais Sudi mentioned that they are looking for different options to promote the book, such as government pages and their website. Overall, it was a productive and enriching meeting where we shared our passions for reading and writing, and committed to continue working together on future projects. First, they asked us to wait while they prepared the microphone for the presentation. He had a newly acquired yellow microphone and was excited to speak. Knowing that some wanted to introduce themselves first, Mariana offered to speak first. She works on a project called Animal that focuses on special children and older adults. Mariana really likes reading and has several favorite authors, including some foreigners. He also mentioned that he is working on a book about the Rio Grande. And Patricia Vera, for her part, is working on a centenary project that involves the publication of a book with the participation of various local writers. This book will be published both on paper and in digital format on its website. She believes it is important to give writers who are not involved in politics or government the opportunity to stand out and showcase their talent. Regarding my personal interests, I really enjoy the horror genre and one of my favorite authors is Stephen King. I also like to read about myths and legends, and in particular, about the city and the land of fire. I think it's important to have a variety of authors and genres represented so everyone can find something they like. In short, I think it's important to promote diversity in literature and give all writers the chance to stand out and showcase their talent. We shouldn't limit ourselves to one genre or one group of authors, and we should be open to discovering new talent and perspectives. This book that I have in my hands was planned so that the boys in my group of friends read it together, between 10 and 15 minutes each, in order to learn more about its content. I suggested it because I thought it might interest Catalina, Jesse, Mayako, Martin, and other people I know. The initial presentation was already done, so there is no need to mention it again. The idea was that we read the book simultaneously, but in the end not everyone did it at the same pace. The book contains an interesting story and I want to share a snippet with you. It's about a girl named Maria, who dressed in a new dress that made her somewhat uncomfortable. However, when her mother entered the room, she asked her to pray together and ask for forgiveness. Maria did not want to do it and refused, which caused an unexpected reaction in her mother. In short, this book has been a good reading experience and I liked sharing it with my friends. No mom, I raised my hand and turned her face away. I saw a red mark and waited for his reaction, but I didn't find any. I raised my right hand and made a fist. I hit him hard on the cheek and saw a few kilos of blood come out. My mother lunged at me with her eyes full of royal anger and public acceptance. Mom, this isn't going to stop me either, I yelled as I let out a whoop. I hit myself in the mouth with my right hand and saw how blood stained my fingers. I stared at her and ran a bloody finger across the cover of her Bible dipped in the blood of the Lamb 31. Many times he and I followed through, I continued. He lifted his habit and looked up. Her fountain eyes had a terrifying expression of a severely lonely vigilante. Nobody makes fun of the man, he said. Wally insecurity is that your sin will be discovered. Carville rips out your body, the demon's power, and burns what it brings. She burst out alone, and the door closed behind her. I heard loud banging on the door, But I didn't care. I walked away a few minutes after she had left and headed down the stairs to the street on my way to work. Before beginning a detailed analysis of the same night as the godmother party, I would like to summarize what we know about me. We know that I am the victim of my mother's religious obsession. We know that I have a latent kinetic disability, commonly designated by the initials 13. We know that I have an unusual talent that is actually an inherited trait produced by a formerly recessive gene and rarely noticed. It is suspected that Mika's yes ability endures happy means which to have. The nature of my lack of ability is something that has been studied. We know that I demonstrated my ability as a child, in extreme situations of guilt and tension. We also know that a second such situation occurred in the school shower, and some theorize that this was when my stylistic ability manifested itself, as a result of psychological and physiological factors. Finally, we know that a third extension situation occurred at the end of year dance that caused the terrible events that we will analyze below. Earlier I was in my room, preparing the flowers for my dress. My mother was not there, of course, to do it for me. She had locked herself in the chapel and had been praying hysterically for the past 2 hours. When I was satisfied with the way the flowers had turned out, I dropped my arms and stood still for a moment with my eyes closed. There was no full-length mirror, so I opened my eyes and looked at myself in the small mirror on the dresser. I was dressed in a simple straight skirt and a rose was attached to my left shoulder. In the other room, the chapel, my mother's voice could be heard rising and falling in terrifying, incoherent cycles. The black forest bought with coupons indicated the 7 churches, perhaps an elaborate joke. It was the ultimate mockery of the ultimate joke. Tickets and half the night with assortment of desire for cheese. Full carved against 15. Everything was a nice way of saying that my mother was crazy. At that moment, on the hallowed ground, my eyes were opened and I heard the sound of trumpets. "We will regret it," my mother yelled. The story was brutal, but I needed to accept it in order to be vulnerable to whatever the night might bring. Definitely, that planted download was not what I thought. But now, thinking about it, what was the best thing to do? When I thought of visiting my mother, I knew that I would be safe with her. Although she might not be the most fantastic, normal or wise, I wanted to stay with her in her house. Never before have I met so many funny girls who laugh, work and take off their headscarves. If I didn't come or back down and quit, my existence would be monotonous, goalless, and emotionless. The sporting events and TV shows I watched in that house were boring, so I thought I'd start picking things up and creating objects to fill my free time. Coming home from school one night, I saw a car parked on the main street and pushed it 20 feet along the curb effortlessly. The idlers in front of the courthouse stared at me in amazement, but I smiled to myself. This book that I am reading is very beautiful and the music that accompanies it is fascinating. The author tells the story very specifically and with a lot of fantasy. The protagonist's mother seems to be very fanatical and wants all her beliefs to be fulfilled, just like her family. Now let's talk about a myth or legend that you want to share with me. Then we can continue with Maria's project. What do you think? At my company, we used to receive salaries that were up to 6 times the amount of money we were paid for transportation. At one point, we started a claim that had the support of colleagues from other wineries and the entire community. The conflict started at the door of our workplace, but we had to hide when the police arrested 4 representatives of the union that peacefully represented our rights. Despite this, we took over the municipality and the police blocked the road and even advanced to Cafayate to free our compañeros. Finally, the conflict was resolved with the intervention of the state, which took over the debts of the wine estate and charged the salaries of the employees. This conflict became a historical event for me and for the people, and was published in the newspapers of the time. However, the community has always been interested in knowing more details about what happened. Ricardo Viva and Establos Mujer, both members of the Secretariat of Family Agriculture, together with the filmmaker Santiago Alvarez, began an intense and interesting investigation. They consulted newspapers, spoke with journalists, covered interviews with the musician Testar and Sarah to find out what motivated him to compose the song that Between the Lines talks about the conflict in the valley. Then, they traveled to Germany to build the story by telling the trees, since the subject of peasant struggles interested them a lot. However, the problem was that the valley conflict was left out of the official history of the brand, and the team needed to reach out to the community to obtain more information. We decided to run memory recovery workshops with students from a secondary school, and for 2.5 years we traveled there several times. With the boys, we teach them interview techniques and we also teach them how to use cameras. The interesting thing about this work at the school was that the students not only learned the history of their town, but also interviewed their grandparents who lived in El Valle del Anima. The story that I am going to share with you is that of the people of Animana and their fight for their labor rights. I was part of the team that did extensive research on this fight and how it has stuck in the collective memory over the years. It all started when the company we worked for paid us very low salaries compared to what we should have received. We mobilized and received the support of colleagues from other wineries and from the entire community. The claim began at the door of our workplace, but when the police arrested 4 representatives of the union that represented our rights, everything got complicated. We also took over the municipality and cut off the road, even advancing to Cafayate to obtain the release of our compañeros. Finally, the conflict was resolved thanks to the intervention of the state, which took over the debts of the wine estate and charged the salaries of the employees. The animal became a historical event for the town, which was published in the newspapers of the time. However, the community was always interested in finding out more details about what happened, and that was how Ricardo Viva and Establos Mujer, both members of the Secretariat of Family Agriculture, together with the filmmaker Santiago Alvarez, began an intense and interesting investigation. They consulted newspapers, spoke with journalists and even interviewed the musician Testar y Sarah to find out what motivated him to compose the song that talks about the conflict between the lines. Then they traveled to Animana to build the story through the story of the inhabitants. They knew that entering the community would not be easy, since we were 3 strangers. For this reason, we decided to offer memory recovery workshops with students from a secondary school. During 2.5 years, we traveled there several times and taught them techniques for conducting interviews and recording with cameras. It was a very enriching experience. The result of the workshops was a medium-length film called Where There Was a Fire, which compiled images of the workshops and a mural about El Animal made with the boys. In addition, we made a film that reflects on the construction of memory and oblivion. Well, unfortunately, what happened in Animana was forgotten due to fear. Because the fight to block routes was against the only source of work that the people of the town had to cover their expenses and to be able to help their families. It is important to note that most of the growers were from the same area as the owners of the farm, who were foreigners and did not mind paying a fair amount for the crops that were grown. At that time, there was only one farm in the town, called Finca Ni Mana. All the people worked there, and many did not receive their due pay. It is a story that deserves to be told and remembered, so that it is not repeated anywhere else. Their expenses and to be able to help their families. It is important to note that most of the growers were from the same area as the owners of the farm, who were foreigners and did not mind paying a fair amount for the crops that were grown. At that time, there was only one farm in the town, called Finca Ni Mana. All the people worked there, and many did not receive their due pay. It is a story that deserves to be told and remembered, so that it is not repeated anywhere else. As for the concept of the movie, I loved the story it tells, but it left me with a bit of uncertainty since it is a national thriller and it is not yet known if it will be released soon. It depends on the payments and how production develops. There's a lot of confusing stuff and it's not quite clear what happened and why certain events happened, which makes it kind of a tragedy in itself. As for me, I'm interested in knowing more about what happens inside the place and how the characters relate to each other. It is a plot that generates a lot of anxiety and keeps me expectant. In addition, the tradition between the families that is shown in the film catches my attention. On the other hand, I find it impressive to think about how at the time when the man who became the greatest of all time lived, There were no airplanes or other means of transportation as we know them today. There were also no computers, television or the internet. In this sense, I find it interesting when my teacher explains things about history and places, since we can learn many things from other people. But when I read the words of the Bible, I feel that they go straight to my heart. This is because Jesus, as the only one who lived in heaven before coming to earth to be with God, knew how important it was to start teaching what he had learned. He had been a great son of our Father and was able to pass on to human beings what he had learned. Previously, he had called several people over a few days, but many were busy or unable to speak at the time. As a friend and teacher, I am often busy, but I am always willing to listen and help where I can. I love talking about nature and how we can learn so much from it. I once talked about fruit trees and how to select the best ones, which can apply to many things in life. I also like to talk about the birds and the flowers, and how God cares about all things in life, including the little things. Sometimes I even use poetry to reflect on what is happening in the world, including the corruption and evil that exist in different social spheres. When asked why Jesus was a great teacher, my answer is simple, because he was always with the poor, helping them and praying for them. Jesus taught us the Word of God and showed us how to live our lives according to it. He deeply cared for those in need and worked to help them, even saving lives. Although he also faced many difficulties in his life, he always kept his faith in God and never gave up. In these difficult times, we can learn a lot from his example and do what we can to help others. After what happened, it was all pretty amazing. The image I saw was very helpful. I was walking around and suddenly I saw something that seemed to be a stipe filament. I examined it for a few minutes and then walked out of there as the police were starting to ask questions. Still, I managed to get a snippet. Later, while listening to music, I thought about my stepfather, who always bragged about having everything under control. Despite the hard times, my father found a way to help me get an education, connecting with former comrades to secure my job at the municipal corralon. Although the job was fairly humble, it was not demanding and only required him to sweep streets and mow grass. In the jobs created by the municipality to employ unemployed labor, 5 holes were made in the battery of the speakers and 8 screws were used. That reminded me of a driver who used to take us in his truck every day. Surprisingly, it turned out to be Sonia's husband, an old acquaintance of mine and a road worker by trade. Although he always talked about his job, he was also known to be a cuckold. Those words always come to mind when I think of him, trucks by trade and cuckold by vocation, he said without teeth. When I heard the music, I was in the turmoil sector on the Euphrates River. The water had dried up, leaving the mourners free to pass, and Roberto's voice resounded through the temple's speakers. People listened attentively, and the girls in long skirts sighed with more interest. My young brother was in the crowd, absorbed in the phrases of the apocalypse. Meanwhile, I watched the gum of my mouth and thought about the world of beasts and false prophets. Suddenly, 3 spirits with the appearance of 3 branches came out, and Pastor Salvador won the microphone. Everyone listened attentively, while the pastor concentrated his chin and wore a suit that reflected all the lights in the room. When it was his turn, the shepherd did not resort to big signs. He was sure they all knew what to expect. He urged us to be sure that we had nothing to weigh on our hearts, since we could deceive the whole world, but Proximo knew very well what was hidden in our hearts. From the last row in the O, I got the impression that the man, except for the holy man, was studying Andres, who had been flirting with the idea of stepping foot in that place. Roberto Aviles had chosen that night to make his appearance, and everything seemed to be connected in some way. When we were in the family assembly, the pastor wanted me to read some readings, but no one else wanted to share that moment. I presented myself with a jacket and tie, as befits such cases, and the pastor made a sign for me to begin. I started reading, but soon realized that the 3 pages I had in my hands talked about evil spirits that infiltrate religion and take advantage of the beauty of the world. Andres, who was sitting next to me, shook his head in disapproval. Meanwhile, I was still reading and couldn't help but think that this all seemed crazy. Although Roberto, the pastor, seemed very sincere in his words. I wondered how long it would take for him to become just another hypocrite like some others I had known. Suddenly, the pastor stopped and signaled to the choir to start singing. The meeting continued, but some people began to faint and fall to the ground. It was something that happened frequently, although it always scared me to see it. Before it was too late, the pastor warned us that God would judge us for our hidden acts, even if no one else knew about them. The people seemed fearful and looked for support anywhere, even on the walls of the temple. The air was excessively dense and many people fainted. Finally, the meeting came to an end and we all went home. Although the speech of the readers had been interesting, he felt that there was too much madness in the atmosphere and that everything that was said was too extreme. I hoped that they would continue like this in the future and that people could understand that reading others is the best. Back then, technology was not yet what it is now, but I knew that our future was full of possibilities and opportunities.